Hello everyone, I'm Justin Fernandez, Office Manager, Germany Center of Excellence, Manipal Center for European Studies, MAHE Manipal. I welcome you all to the session 7, Globalization and Transnational Education, Dynamics of Diversity. This session will delve into the problems and difficulties posed by borders in the internationalization of higher education. It will explore issues like ways of diffusing disparities across borders, strategies of and policies for internationalization, and interconnections between globalization and internationalization. I would now like to invite Mr. Rahul Putty, who is the chair of this session. Rahul Putty is the coordinator of Department of Languages, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Along with his pivotal role in institution building, he is engaged in the designing and teaching of innovative modules centered on culture and linguistic mediation. He was dubbed PhD scholar at International Center for Higher Education Research, Kassel, Germany. With his PhD dissertation on representation of universities in academic fiction from transnational perspectives, his academic qualifications and areas of interest include European cultural studies, higher education and history, and language pedagogy. A few reminders request to all the presenters to limit their presentations to 15 minutes. If it's fine with the chair, I will take care of the time and ring a bell at the 13th minute, just like this one. And then also request all the presenters to keep their cameras on throughout the session. Just another announcement. Two of our presenters, Dr. Robert Colon and Dr. Fabrizio Trifero, will not be able to join us today live. We have their pre-recorded presentations, which we will be sharing. So yeah, I request Mr. Putty to take over now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Justin Fernandez, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you. And it's my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you to the 7th session of India-EU Higher Education Meet, being organized by Manipal Center for European Studies, Manipal. Today's session promises to be very rich, with a distinguished panel who will be deliberating on a range of topical issues under the overarching category of globalization, a ubiquitous word as much in higher education as in other spheres of social life. The topics are wide-ranging, the perspectives are from different geographical parts of the world. We have Dr. Robert Colon, who would be talking about the diffusion of borders and graduates' transversal skills. And along with it, we have a subject that is related to something closer home, the case of international branch campuses and the position of India in this matter, from Dr. Jessica Schüller, Dr. Padmakumar Nair, and Dr. Jason Lane. And we have also the aspect of recognition of qualifications from UK with regards to transnational education, from Dr. Fabrizio Trifero, and coming all the way from Southeast Europe, from Croatia, we have Dr. Tamara Dagen and Melita Kovačević, who would be talking about the impact of internationalization on higher education policies. So it's the panel definitely promises to offer some very rich insight into these matters. Before we start the session, let me also have the pleasure of introducing our panelists a little more in detail. I will start with Dr. Robert Colon, but who unfortunately will not be able to join us today, and we will be having his pre-recorded presentations playing out along with that of Dr. Fabrizio Trifero, who is also unfortunately not able to join us today. So that leaves us with three presenters or three three topics that would be deliberated live. That is the reframing internationalization, the case of India's international branch campus regulation, and globalizing impact on internationalization, higher education policies, Southeast Europe perspective. So let me introduce all our panelists in turn, as has been mentioned in the schedule. Dr. Robert Colon is Professor of Internationalization of Higher Education and Director of the Center for Internationalization of Education. He has a vast experience of 16 years in executive roles and several years experience in research in the area of internationalization and higher education. He has a PhD from the University of Western Australia, a bachelor's and a master's degree from Doctoral University in Melbourne, Australia, and a graduate certificate of education from James Cook University, Australia. And our panelists deliberating on the case of India's international branch campuses are Jessica D. Schüller, who is a doctoral researcher at Miami University, Ohio, and a graduate of the Erasmus Mundus MAHE program. She's worn many hats in international higher education, as an international student practitioner, and now as a budding researcher. Her research interests include transnational education, international employability, and inclusive internationalization. Joining her is Dean and Professor at LM Thapar School of Management, Dr. Padmakumar Nair. His expertise covers a wide variety of fields and disciplines from physics, social entrepreneurship, evolutionary psychology, and behavioral economics. And in the same panel, in the same group, we also have Dr. Jason Lane, who's Dean of Miami University's College of Education, Health and Society. He's co-founder of the Cross-Border Education Research Team, widely known as CBIRD, and is an internationally renowned expert on international branch campuses. Coming to Dr. Fabrizio Trifiro, is an expert in the regulation, quality assurance, and recognition of transnational education. He heads ECCPIS's, which was formerly known as UK NARIC, quality benchmark services aimed at supporting the recognition of international qualifications, and leads strategic engagement with key international and national stakeholders. At ECCTIS, he developed the Transnational Education Quality Benchmark, the first international scheme aimed at supporting the global portability of transnational education qualifications. And our colleagues from Croatia, we have Dr. Tamara Dagen, who holds a PhD from the University of Zagreb. Her research interests are policy analysis in higher education. She published a book, Impact of Globalization on Internationalization of Universities, with Danica Fink-Hafner, and several articles related to higher education. Since 2016, she has been affiliated researcher at the University of Ljubljana, Faculty of Social Sciences Research Group, working on the implementation of a Delphi method in higher education. And her colleague, Melita Kovačević, is a full professor at the University of Zagreb. She has been involved in the policy of higher education for 2 decades and has held different positions on national and European levels related to higher education. As a keynote or plenary, has delivered more than 150 speeches worldwide on higher education reform, academic leadership, and doctoral education. She's also former vice rector for research and technology of the University of Zagreb between 2006 to 2014. So, dear panelists, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this session. And since we have this development in the sense that Dr. Cohen is not with us here today live, so if it's all right, may I invite the team of Jessica Schüller, Padmakumar Nair, and Jason Lane to start the panel proceedings.
Yes, give me 1 minute to share my slides with you. All right. Can everyone see? Are we looking okay there? Perfect. Okay. Yes, thank you for the introduction, and also good morning and good afternoon from our end. We are going to be looking at India's international branch campus policy and how it aligns or misaligns within the National Education Policy 2020, which I know also was a big conversation in the last session. So what we would like to do in this short amount of time is look at first, what is the policy and what does it mean within the context of the National Education Policy 2020? What types of assumptions, both in general for internationalization as well as for international branch campuses, are kind of underlying the policy? And how can we use the reframing approach to think about alignment with domestic needs and internationalization efforts? So naturally, policymaking in this area is relatively complex. Education and social problems are wicked problems, and there are no universal solutions that will be fitting everywhere. And a lot of the theories and practices of internationalization in higher ed have been developed in a Western context. And as also was mentioned in the previous session, Indian policymakers have limited experience in this area. Together, this creates a new and unexplored context of a developing country going through a major economic development and using internationalization efforts to expand and improve domestic education programs and policies. And so the context is that the National Education Policy document of 2020 was really innovative in that, in that it created for the first time after about 2 decades worth of iterative attempts for an international branch campus policy, finally a policy that was clear and written out. The complication, though, with the policy, the overall policy and the IBC policy together, was that there seemed to be a bit of misalignment in what the international branch campus policy was attempting to achieve and what the overarching goals in the education policy, which spans the entire education system. So in looking at that, our research question became, how can the Indian international branch campus policy be aligned with domestic education goals? And so if we first take a look at what the policy actually is, we have to back out and think about what are the broader goals that are trying to be, or that are, that we're looking at in the NEP. And these include things like enhancing quality teaching, working on curriculum innovation, expanding access and inclusion initiatives, and also working towards more community engagement in the higher education ecosystem. So if we think about these broader goals that are put forth in the policy and how they are represented, not only overall, but also with each kind of mini policy along the way, looking at the international branch campus policy provides a means to understand alignment. And so we took a look at, in general, how much of internationalization policy is actually in this document and how much weight does it actually pull. And we did a bit of quantitative textual analysis, both on the document in its entirety, as well as on the higher education section alone. And really what we found is that there is not a huge emphasis put on these initiatives overall in the NEP, and these primarily are those that are there are primarily in the higher education section and primarily focusing on this international branch campus policy. Some of the other mentions for global are taking place primarily at the secondary or even at the primary level. And so the IB policy itself is roughly 1 paragraph, and really what it's saying is that high-performing Indian universities can set up campuses abroad, and that for the first time, select universities, those from among the top 100 universities in the world, are able to operate in India. There's also a sentence around how a legislative framework will provide structures in which these institutions can or will be treated on par with other institutions in India. And so when we look at this, there's basically 2 directions happening. The first one is that Indian institutions are setting up campuses abroad, so the export of Indian higher ed, and then the second part is foreign universities setting up campuses in India, so the import of foreign education into India's domestic education system. And we are really only looking at this second part. This import focus has two kind of key elements. The first one is the top 100, which is not clear as to which global university ranking we're pulling from when we talk about the top 100. And the second part of that is, regardless actually of which global university ranking you take, and I will illustrate this in a second, we're really talking about importing a sort of US research university model. And to the first point, which top 100, when we look at global university rankings, and this will not come as a surprise to anyone, we're really talking about the Anglosphere and English-speaking countries, and of course then English-taught institutions and programs, and those that are, research university models. And so just in looking at, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see 5 of the most common global university rankings. And the color coding is to show the overlap between the institutions. And there was only 2 institutions that were represented that were from outside the English-speaking world. The only difference is if you look at the Time Higher Education Impact rankings, then you're not seeing a lot of overlap. So we're seeing kind of the same institutions over and over again, and primarily also the second part, which is a US research university model. And when we import education from foreign countries, we also inherit certain things. And of course, a lot can be done with regulatory frameworks, but we still need to keep in mind what type of structures might be recreated. And so Rhodes took a look at identified 4 pathologies of the US research university model. The first being microempiricism. So basically, instead of looking widely at problems that are complex and hard to solve, the US research university culture really tried to bring things down onto a micro level to make them easier to study, and also easier to claim causality. And this really led into kind of a hierarchy of the sciences that still permeates many of our institutions today. There's also an added component of complicity in military violence, as far as certain inventions being crafted in between university research centers and the military. And then the last part, which is also particularly important for the Indian context, because the NEP really emphasizes holistic and multidisciplinary education as the way forward. The US research university functions on a neoliberal model that is in contrast to that in many cases. And so if we think about top 100 and we think about the US research university model that would then become those select foreign universities that are entering the country, just kind of zooming back out to those broader NEP goals, we're kind of asking ourselves a few key questions about the seemingly misalignment there between what the domestic situation is and what it might mean to import these campuses. So we were asking, how is quality being defined through this policy? What opportunities are or will be created through international branch campuses, and who will have access to them? What is the purpose or motivation behind this policy? And is the policy created for long-term development or short-term success? So this got us thinking about what types of assumptions are underlining this policy. So what are we thinking, or what are the assumptions that may be enforcing or led to the creation of this policy? And of course, there's going to be a lot, and we won't have time to cover all of them, but we do want to focus on 3 that we think are imperative to understanding this misalignment a bit better. The first one shouldn't come as a surprise because it's been widely discussed in the literature and in media reports, and that is the assumption that top-ranked universities from abroad are interested in opening branch campuses in India. The second assumption is that Indian students will find it attractive to study at Indian branch campuses. And coupled with that is also the assumption that Indian employers will be inclined to hire international branch campus graduates over graduates from top-tier Indian universities or from top-tier universities abroad. And the third assumption that we wanted to highlight is that, the assumption that branch campuses will be able to overcome the 4F challenges. So those are faculty, fellow students, facilitation, and finances faced by other Indian universities. And naturally, these assumptions were from the policy itself, but there's also broader internationalization assumptions that impact not just the Indian context, but internationalization policy making across the globe. And some of these are, for example, that internationalization is inherently good or neutral or natural, that it's desired by all stakeholders, that it has limited or no consequences, and that these internationalization policies can be just simply transferred across countries. And so this brought us into a thought process around how can we use a reframing model to think about an alignment that is more suited towards the domestic, an alignment of the internationalization effort, in this case, the international branch campus policy, that is more suited for the domestic goals that are set forth in the NEP 2020. And so reframing is a process of redefining a problem or a situation by changing or redefining the underlying assumptions. And so it's really an iterative process of coming back to what are the different assumptions that are informing this policy, and are they accurate, are they true, and how can we maybe reshape them or reframe them to generate more innovative and appropriate policy solutions. And so the reframing process is, there's a couple of steps in it. The first one is stating the problem or situation as it is, identifying the underlying implicit and explicit assumptions behind that problem or solution or situation, refining those assumptions using the reframing framework, and then based on the new assumptions, redefining the problem so that those innovative policy solutions can be created. And really what this entails is moving from assumptions to reframing and internationalization. So going from what are our domestic assumptions and how, and to a certain extent also thinking about, instead of looking outwards at what are other countries doing and how can we implement that here at home, thinking about what is it that we need here at home and what types of models or programs or policies abroad might be fit for purpose in our domestic context. So moving from domestic assumptions and thinking about those to the broader internationalization assumptions, and then narrowing back in to what are the specific, in this case, we're focusing on the international branch campus policy assumptions that we need to reframe to make sure that the policy is fit for purpose. And so this reframing process really leads into a realignment of the domestic needs with internationalization efforts, and then of course focus on a specific policy. What this might look like in the Indian context, and of course the reframing process is iterative, so this has just been kind of one iteration of it. What we can read out of the policy document is that internationalization is kind of being positioned in this way of modernizing or making Indian higher education competitive. And a reframing iteration could be, for example, how can we engage all stakeholders to develop an IBC policy that's conducive to serving the broader goals outlined in the national education policy? And so when we think about reframing assumptions, when we think about reframing IBC assumptions, we need to recall back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that education policy, social policy, the administration of public goods, these are all very wicked problems. So we are not searching for a universal solution here. There's no perfect IBC policy or any of that. And the other aspect is just thinking about reframing our assumptions around the specific institutional model, which is private in nature and it's also criticized for that, but it can serve public goals. And so just to recap, I mean, this has been one kind of, like I said, iteration of using the reframing framework, which you see here on the screen, thinking about what assumptions and goals and needs are underlying, stakeholders, resources, history, the objectives, and kind of in general, and how can we interrogate that and work with that in order to create a more refined IBC policy that's aligned with domestic goals. So that is it from our end. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Schüller. Thank you for the deep dive into the multi-layered context of international branch campuses and in the relation to the new national education policy. And paradigm, your arguments and analysis, by framing it in terms of the assumption, reframing and realignment. Aspects were indeed most thought-provoking, and I'm sure it would invite a healthy discussion when we move on to the question and answer session. Once again, many thanks. So now I move to the second presentation this afternoon, where we have Tamara Dagen and Melita Kovačević, who would be talking about globalization impact on internationalization, higher education policies, and Southeast Europe perspective. Over to you, Dr. Dagen.
So, good afternoon from the University of Zagreb. I'm very happy that today I can present you the paper, The Impact of Globalization on the Internationalization of Higher Education Policies, especially from the perspective of Southeast European countries, which is prepared in collaboration with my colleague, Professor Melita Kovačević. Let me now first try to share the screen on our presentation. I hope you can see it. Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah, so great. Firstly, let me very short to tell a few words on the motivation for our paper. Well, the starting point was the highly changed context in which higher education systems and higher education institutions are operating today. They are faced with many changes that in our opinion, were mostly triggered by the process of globalization. Of course, some of those changes might be perceived either positive, either negative, but still, we argue that globalization impact globally created even bigger imbalances between West and the East, North and the South, and that it impacted some sub-regions and countries which are now lagging behind. And for these reasons, we try to reflect on all these processes, differences and similarities from the Southeast Europe perspective, and to compare states that are belonging to this European area, which sometimes is perceived through geographical lens and sometimes through the geopolitical lens. We see internationalization as a possible answer for overcoming some of these existing gaps and imbalances, and we also try to look in our paper on differences in internationalization policies across the European countries. So, firstly, I will, in this presentation, say a few words about this changed context of higher education in 21st centuries. Then we will see some insights about European higher education as a regional model, and I will present you shortly definitions that we used in the analysis in our paper, and at the end I will present some insights that we got from our analysis and few recommendations as a conclusion. So as I said, during the last decade, higher education worldwide has passed through significant changes. Some of them tremendously influenced the transformation of higher education globally. We have accelerated communication supported by the development of new technologies, massification, increased competitiveness, and many other changes. And due to the emergence of new collaboration models and increased mobility of students and researchers worldwide, blurred physical borders between regions, countries, institutions, and individuals, leaving higher education systems and universities to find their solutions to this new reality. So as I said, our opinion is that many changes and challenges in higher education were firstly triggered by the process of globalization and its last wave that started at the beginning on 21st century represented a process that was somehow external to higher education, but it still impacted very, very hardly, and internationalization that was always a part of higher education and academia started to change in parallel with the globalization process. So globalization changed society in which higher education institutions operate. It forced them to adopt to the new circumstances, and these accelerated processes inside universities put a pressure to them and to their managements to create new missions and goals and to initiate new policies and activities. Looking at Europe as a world region, it is very important to differentiate Europe as a geographical area and the European Union as a unique international state, which is characterized by different forms of integration, which are more or less formalized depending on the policy area. And as we presented in this slide, in Europe, there are different so-called state clusters, which bring us to the next slide, in which we try to give you the context of European higher education system as a regional model. It is the whole policy of the European Union lies on the subsidiarity principles, and the higher education policy in Europe at the supranational level has characteristics of a soft law policy, leaving the national states, states members, main competence in this field. But still at the supranational level from 1999, when the Bologna reform was initiated, there are many decisions, programs, recommendations that are created at the supranational level in coordination of all the members, not only the EU, but also all the countries that have signed the Bologna Declaration and started with Bologna reform and decided to be the part of the European higher education area and European research area. So the Bologna process indeed was the trigger that started a new chapter in European higher education system. The main idea was to harmonize the significantly different higher education system across the European countries, but also to find one unique European answer to deal with the changes in higher education that happen globally. And of course, Europe wanted to be more competitive and to promote European citizens' mobility and employability. As a consequence, internationalization became a very important part of this whole higher education policy. And today it has two streams, the inter-European internationalization and internationalization among the European higher education institutions and their partners from other world regions. So on this slide, we try to present very briefly the whole process of starting the Bologna reform and different time sequence when the countries, not only the member states of the European at the level of the supranational policy in Europe. So, as the aim of our paper was to look at the globalization, we had to also take care of its intervening with the process of Europeization in Europe and to analyze the effects of internationalization policies in higher education at all the levels. So here are very shortly presented different definitions that we use in our analysis in order to understand the topic and the main question of our analysis. And as you can see, as globalization is perceived as a worldwide social connecting in the area of higher education, we decided to use different approach regarding Europeization. And we somehow differentiate globalization and its impact in broader terms on the Europeization model, and that is, those are policies that go beyond the EU borders. And of course, in a narrow sense, Europeization represents the process of internationalization in the higher education field based on policy making and the implementation within the EU framework. So when we look at Southeast European perspective, so the first clue was that we saw there are many diversities among the various European sub-regions, and although in reality there is no general consensus on the categorization of the countries belonging to Southeastern Europe, we decided to use and follow one categorization that was made in the framework of the Southeast Europe Transnational Cooperation Program. There are two reasons why we decided to follow this categorization. Firstly, it shows very interesting diversities among 14 countries that are part of the program, and also two additional countries which only partially are involved in this program. And secondly, this categorization enabled identifying the most powerful forces that potentially influence various developmental speeds and routes in specific countries and in some specific sub-regions. We decided to look at two types of data, and we share it somehow into different lines. First are general data. We look at the size of the country, its population, GDP per capita, historical roots, and EU membership. And in the second step, we look at characteristics of higher education systems that directly influence internationalization policies, and it is percentage of the public investment in higher education, country membership in the European higher education area and Erasmus program, and the global flow of tertiary level students. And I will now shortly try to present you some insights, first insights that we got from our analysis. So countries belonging to the Southeastern Europe share a certain red thread that connects their efforts in the development of internationalization, but they also have some various preconditions that influence their abilities to successfully create and implement specific policies. The majority of the countries belonging to this sub-region have less developed internationalization policies in comparison with Western Europe. Still, our analysis, of course, showed there are some exceptions from this point. I can give you an example of Italy or Austria that have a highly developed internationalization policy in the field of higher education. And in that sense, of course, it is not possible to look at all these pool of countries from the same point of view. Still, what we saw in general is that majority of countries belonging to this sub-region have various approaches to internationalization, and what is, I think, very important, they don't have equal capacities and capabilities to follow some together policy created at to some top level. Also, it impacted the situation that all the countries are not following in the same tempo and in the same line the Bologna reform recommendations. they have different developmental speeds and different statuses regarding EU membership and assessment negotiation timing. And it all influence their availability to full take part in various EU programs, schemes, and financial funds. Additional effects such as brain drain and demographic challenges, global financial and economic crisis, a high-level dependence on political actors' decisions, the rise of nationalist and populist policies also had in these countries very important impact on their policies. And what is very important is that some countries have officially adopted strategies in the field of internationalization, but without an implementation process that will follow these decisions. And few recommendations at the end. We think that we can be sure that globalization and Europeization processes created gaps between different world regions, and some countries are lagging behind, especially when we look from the European perspective and Southeast Europe and their countries. And we think that internationalization is a strong force in overcoming some of the gaps and good solution for the creation of new agendas for universities, and also at the national level for creation some new policies and programs at the level of national government. In that sense, countries belonging to the Southeastern Europe should further develop connections with specific countries and world regions and their higher education institutions. They should strengthen internationalization initiatives and activities for academic staff and researchers, develop study programs in English. Sometimes it is not very popular to say that everything should be in English, but we must take into an account that English is a broadly speaking world language and that it is a language of science. And at the national level, government should provide more sufficient funding of higher education and look at this funding as an investment and not as expenditure. So this is what we prepare for today. We are open for your questions, and we would gladly like to participate in a discussion at the end of this session. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dagen, for that highly nuanced and highly rationalized account of existing categories and terminologies, firstly, which you have very effectively carried out with regards to the specificities of internationalization policies in the context of Southeast Europe. And I hope that this also opens up to a healthy discussion. And since we have the other two presentations in absent here, maybe if it's all right with you, I could invite the audience to ask the questions now, and we would then play the pre-recorded presentations that our other panel members have sent us. So should that be all right with you, Dr. Dagen? Yes, and Ms. Jessica Schüller, if that's all right with you as well. Yeah, okay. So let me see if firstly there are questions in the chat box here, and I invite the audience to feel free to raise their hand and pose their questions to our panelists. Just check. Okay, do not see any questions as such.
Mostly comments, yeah.
All comments or observations. Yes, of course, that was specified that. Since we do not have any questions or observations or comments, I may venture with one of my own, and that is with regards to the first presentation, the case of India's international branch campus regulation. If I may ask Mr. Schüller, was this carried out mainly based on the policy document analysis, or did it also involve interviews with the policy makers?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, it was just focused up to now on the policy document analysis.
Right. And I think I found it very interesting that that this particular word count that you carried out and kind of actually reveals already something with regards to underlying assumptions or certain undertones even that may accompany the drafting of such important policy documents. Was it something that you already expected, or you kind of more, let's say, surprised to discover that?
Yeah, so we obviously took a look at the entire document, and so when you read it in its entirety, you do notice that already, but I still thought it was surprising to see the actual quantitative textual analysis come back and the numbers so low.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I could continue to have this conversation with you. Yes, there is a question here, and that's nice, so that we have a larger interaction with the audience as well. And this is specifically to you, Ms. Schüller. Do you think there's enough preparedness among Indian universities to establish, what I suppose, international branch campuses?
So I think this is referring also to like the export of Indian higher education abroad, and that would be something that I think is very individual for each institution, but also needs to be examined as far as what that looks like for, what are the underlying assumptions, and then what are the structures in place to really support those institutions abroad, and is a complete analysis being done around, what is the viability of those certain locations that are being chosen for those campuses.
Jessica, I could jump in here too, just to add, despite the policy that just was passed, India has actually been an international leader in the export of international branch campuses for many years. And so from the data that CBER has collected, we've noted that many Indian campuses have already had presences overseas, a lot of those in the Middle East, Manipal being one of them. I've visited Manipal's campus in Dubai. And have actually proven, I think, to be successful in at least the creation of branches, the attraction of students, and the graduation of students. And so success obviously matters on what your metric is for success. But I think if you look at the broad corpus of the 250 plus branch campuses that we've tracked around the world, not all of the Indian campuses have been successful, but nor have all the American campuses been successful in this space. And so there are some examples out there of Indian campuses, Indian-based universities that have been successful. But that's not a carte blanche answer to say all Indian campuses are prepared for exporting a branch campus. It takes a lot of work to do these things.
I mean, if I may extend this discussion with you, Celine, since I'm very familiar with work. What do you think would be some of the reasons for trepidations by foreign universities, firstly, to establish campuses in India, besides the what may seem to be a slightly or highly restrictive environment, and that besides this paradoxical position that, as you rightly pointed out, where India on the one hand encourages its own higher education institutions to transcend borders, whereas when it comes to setting or inviting, as the terms are used, foreign players to establish campuses in India, the outlook may seem somewhat different. And perhaps an added question that the actual risks and the since it's a highly it's a venture which is fraught with a lot of uncertainties, as we have seen. It's not just the emergence of explosion of branch campuses, which happened maybe in the first and second flushes, of their growth, but over the last years, this might seem a little more, could I say, hesitation of universities across the world before they venture into a project like this. And perhaps now with the pandemic, it may perhaps give rise to other dynamics too. So I would love to hear your views on this matter.
Is that to me? It was, I'm sorry, but my audio, it broke up a little bit on your question.
I'm not sure if I will be able to reformulate it in the same way. So perhaps I could invite your colleague there, Jessica Schüller, to perhaps let's start with her comments, and then I will add on as we go along. Yeah.
I think you were kind of asking about the viability of these these universities being able to set up abroad, right? I think that was the question, Jason.
Oh, well, there's a lot of evidence of branches having been able to set up abroad. It's been happening for, well, we have evidence back for more than 100 years, actually, of universities writ large setting up overseas campuses. The last 20 years has been where we've seen the largest expansion of international branch campuses. I would say again that, having visited a number of Indian campuses that already exist, that they have proven that they can at least operate an institution overseas. They can offer an education. They've been able to attract, in some cases, thousands of students to their overseas locations, which is not everyone has been that successful. Actually, I would say relative to other countries, India is up there as a nation with some of the best exporters, just from a perspective of being able to launch a branch campus and get them off the ground. Now, does that mean that the quality of the education is as high as what is in India? I don't know, right? Per se, it's harder to track those sorts of things. But the same question could be raised about UK branches or US branches. What is a comparable education to what's at home, and how well is that being exported? Versus, and I think is the major question in this realm, is to what extent should an education overseas be exactly like the home campus, versus to what extent should it be tailored to that local context as well, right? Do you only want Indian context, Indian education in Dubai, or should that Indian education be tailored to the Dubai context if that's where you happen to be located? What I would say, though, also more broadly, is we generally see branches as largely education, teaching-focused institutions. They may be branches or extensions of research universities, but at least in the first decade, the focus tends to be on education and teaching. Largely, it's a economic question. To be able to survive, they have to generate revenue, and that often comes from tuition and fees that come from education. But we've done some more research recently. A colleague of mine in Sweden, Hans Pohl, looking at research output. And what we have seen is actually, in some cases, we've seen an evolution of research output happening and increasing, particularly in the U.S. and U.K. branches. But in part, that's also because they were the earliest branches, I think, into this space. And so places like Qatar, the branch campuses are now the largest producer of research. In a place like Malaysia, the international branch campuses now comprise about 10% of Malaysia's overall research capacity. So again, what is success? Is it education, or is it research, or some other metric? But we've seen Indian campuses actually set up campuses and be able to pull off the delivery of an education. I've not seen as much evidence in the Indian side of the research productivity at the branch campus yet.
Wonderful.
Does that help answer your question?
Yes. More ways
Okay.
than one. Thank you. Yes, and we have another question here through the paper, but before I ask that, so as to also involve Dr. Dagen, and I keep this question in reserve which you can look at and read it out. You see a systemic divide in establishing branch campuses by public and private Indian universities. But before we get there, let me just ask a small question to Dr. Dagen, because more out of like from my own knowledge, to understand if there is a specific policy body with regards to Southeast Europe. You have the University Association that may be deliberating on some of the aspects that you highlighted in the paper.
Well, what is characteristics of this area, sub-region, is that there are many historical roots and some traditional similarities that connect that higher education systems and the countries, and especially for those countries that, for example, were part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they share the same idea of higher education, same roots, or for example, for ex-Yugoslavia countries, which are now all independent countries, and Croatia and Slovenia are part of as a members of the EU. So it is normal that we have some similar heritage and that we cannot work without collaborating. So the idea of today higher education and research world is to collaborate and collaborate all the time and make it more and more intensive. So in that sense, of course, there are some initiatives, there are some projects that are being established, but mostly I would say at the individual level of some departments, some professors. Of course, the programs which include mobility and some activities that are connected with Erasmus+, they are very good coordinated because they are they have financial aspect that is assured from the European level through the European Commission, and it is easier to establish some kind of connections, consortia, and so on. But still, what I can say for our part of the world is that we look very carefully to better developed universities in the sense of the internationalization. For Croatia, of course, it would be, for example, the University of Vienna. And also we try to make contacts with them. We try to have policy learning activities to see what strategies work better in their cases. But still, it seems that the better connecting and the better understanding of all the stakeholders that are part of higher education arena is needed. I mean, we need some collaborative action from the side of the national governments that will be able to follow the top-down supranational recommendation and policies to filter into some national level strategies that will be supported by financial aspects for the reform, and then to find a best way to somehow make a balance between university autonomy, its management goals and strategies, and these national and European policies, and then to prepare everything to be able to find a specific answer for globalization. So in this term, I think that the process is not so different if you compare it with any other region in the world. But still, my opinion is that capacities are something that maybe we miss. And this is something that we have to deal with and work on it. We have to invest more effort to be, to following some specific policy that will be connected with our heritage. We don't have to leave it, but we have to somehow rename it, redevelop it, and then to become more, prepared for collaborations that can bring us a little bit moving ahead. Yeah.
Just a small question, because I'm afraid I may have missed this point in the presentation. Is there a large difference? Is there a huge difference when it comes to public spending, public funding between the countries in Southeast Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we see sometimes really funding is very important, because I'm coming from the side of the public university. So it is slightly different when you speak on public higher education institutions and when you compare it with private. But at the end of the day, we must know what we want to do with some money we have. So that's why it is very important that university management is eager to develop more and more new activities in the framework of internationalization, and on the same hand that there are good processes and procedures that can be put from top-down level, that the whole university together with our partners and stakeholders can provide and implement the same policy. Sometimes this coordination is missing, and sometimes some initiatives are only supported at the level of, on discursive level, but in reality, it is a little bit more slow. And that's why we have to collaborate with partners that maybe are better, and maybe they had more time to develop some activities.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I may just ask my colleague Justin here. Justin, do you think we could have one more question? I'm not sure about the length of the other two presentations, so could you let me know if I can direct this question to Jessica Schüller and Jason Nair, because if we have just one question, perhaps we can end this session as this direct interaction session with this question. That's all right. Yeah,
we can have one.
Wonderful. So we have the question here. So I invite you, Jessica Schüller and Jason Nair, once again to give your views on this question. If there is a systemic divide in establishing branch campuses by public and private Indian universities.
Jason, I think that might be one for you to take. You're muted somehow.
Sorry about that. Too many mute buttons. I think there is a systemic divide. There inevitably is in most countries in how countries regulate public and private institutions. I think private institutions tend to have a bit more flexibility in how they are able to operate, how they are able to expend funds. Public institutions fall under larger oversight of the government, which can restrict what they can do or not do. On a question of quality, though, I think that's a relative one. Public institutions, in many cases, tend to have at times better. They can have better support. They can have better infrastructure in place to be able to advance research and education, and are often more tied to what the state goals are, and public education and advancing the public good, whereas private institutions are not. I think there's always a question that I've had, and one that has started me studying these things, which is what is the public good of extending a campus overseas if you are a public institution? And I think that's one others can try to answer, but there can be interest in having international branches overseas. But I think there's always a bigger question of how does it align with our mission, purpose, and goals as an institution, whether that be public or private. I got off a little bit on the end there, but there is inevitably a systemic divide between public and private. That's the nature of that question, I think.
Thank you very much. And once again, it was an absolute pleasure to interact with you and to be moderating this session. And I think with this, we come to the end of the live part of this session, and we move on to the presentation mode, the pre-recorded ones, that of Professor Colin and Fabrizio Trifiro. So, Justin, so I can, may I request you to play Robert Colin's presentation?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
In a minute, we'll play.
Thank you very much once again.
Good afternoon. May I first of all thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference. Unfortunately, it is online, and just to be on the safe side, I've recorded this particular presentation just in case my internet connection is insufficient at the time when I'm supposed to give this. I'd like you to join me in looking at internationalization in a slightly different way than we have to up to now. I actually remember my earliest border crossings. We arrived at the border. There was what I would now just call an administrative formality. You had to show your passport. It received a stamp, you got it back. Sometimes they inspected your luggage, sometimes they didn't. And we travel on. And these borders were not very far from home, some 20 kilometers or 55 kilometers in case of another country. Today, many Europeans on the continent are certainly unaware of borders in as much as there is no administrative procedure. And we can travel just about unhindered around the whole continent, and the only way we find out we're in a different country is either the language has changed or it has some culturally distinct features. Goods also travel freely throughout the EU, which saves the EU some 300, nearly 400 billion euros per annum. So, whilst administratively now in Europe, border crossings are largely gone, culturally, of course, they still exist. Academic travel, international academic travel, has had a checkered history. The early information we have about travel encumbrances was through the Authentica Habitat, which was signed by Frederick Barbarossa, one of the Italian emperors, who decreed that scholars and students should be given freedom to travel wherever they wished to. It was the habit of the local authorities to detain someone if they hadn't paid all their rent, or if they couldn't find a person, if they'd absconded, then they would detain someone from the same country, in a way trying to extort the money anyway. In the 16th century, the Spaniards had limited travel options. They were restricted to certain parts of Europe as far as the academic travel is concerned. And at the same time, in Northern Europe, young persons to finish off their academic education undertook what's known as a grand tour, which they traveled usually with a tutor around Europe, going to sites of great cultural significance and to other universities. A century later, wars, either religious or non-religious, interfered with academic travel. And it's really from the 20th century onward, post the Second World War, that we've seen nothing but growth in international student travel. And more recently, of course, and this is an example right now, we've seen the rise of virtual travel, in which we connect via the internet. If we ignore the administrative sort of parts of border crossings. Internationalization activities try and cross natural or cultural borders, even in the absence of a national border. So within one country, you could undertake internationalization activities that bring together people from different cultures and make them interact. Cross-border education, I see that as the movement of persons, programs, or even organizations in the form of a campus across borders. And we can now add virtual crossing via the internet. In effect, if you look at the definition of globalization, the movement of people, goods, and ideas across borders, that's what cross-border education entails. And it, I guess, took an upswing at the time that gaps really started to play a role, because educational services were seen as part of trade in services. Why do we internationalize education? Jane Knight's original definition didn't attempt to include that. She basically said, shorthand, add a intercultural, international, or global dimension to the functions of post-secondary education, and you're internationalizing. With Hans de Wit and Fiona Hunter, we sat down one day doing part of a report for the European Parliament, and we added to Jane Knight's definition that the activity should benefit students and staff to enhance the quality of programs, and society to provide some benefit to society as well. You can see that internationalization is often focused on institutional outcomes or national outcomes as well. It is quite separate from individual outcomes. So, what does a person need to be able to cross the cultural border? And I've defined this in 2016 as having achieved two learning outcomes. One is intercultural competence, which I think is the passport for the cultural border, and international awareness, and to coin not a very recent term, but well, now a very popular term, to be woke about the effects of national, cultural, or ethnic borders, but also international awareness is about our interconnectedness and sustainability of mankind as part of and in balance with the natural world. I think they're the two aspects, if you like, or the two learning outcomes that someone needs to have achieved to be able to effectively cross a cultural border. Now, Van der Zee and Oudenhoven in 2001 created an instrument which measures the ability to interact with culturally diverse individuals. So the better you score on this, the higher your ability to interact with culturally diverse individuals. And it investigates 5 factors: cultural empathy, open-mindedness, emotional stability, social initiative, and flexibility. Now, since that time, beginning of this century, there have been a number of meta-studies looking at intercultural competence tests. And there's some 30 models, 300 constructs, and the MPQ that I just mentioned, each time sort of pops out quite favorably. In the most recent review by Chen and Gabrenia, they said the MPQ is good, but it misses out on some additional personality traits like being non-judgmental, inquisitiveness, cosmopolitanism, and self-awareness. If you look at the short form of the MPQ, and it's been validated, and you look at the items for intercultural empathy or cultural empathy. And what we see is, if you look at this list here, effectively something to do with the empathic trait rather than something to do with culture. I mean, setting others at ease, enjoying other people's stories, sympathizing with others, noticing when someone gets irritated. They're all things about the empathic trait. And just like Chen and Gabrenia, who in their paper said, you know, perhaps belying its title and the name of one of its dimensions, only a few items are contextualized to culture or diversity. Maybe the NPQ measures the ability to interact with diverse individuals. So instead of cultural empathy, you could read empathy for diverse others. Now, the NPQ factors, I think, are as relevant in an intercultural situation as they are in a situation where you interact with individuals who are different from yourself. Cultural empathy becomes empathy by itself. Open-mindedness, social initiative, emotional stability, and flexibility are all personality characteristics that intuitively feels like they would be useful in any diversity interaction. So internationalization as a border diffusing agent, let's assume the achievement of intercultural competence and international awareness and experiences that reinforce these. And of course, language sharing assists in crossing these national cultural borders. I think possession of these strong personality traits of open-mindedness, flexibility, emotional stability, social initiative, empathy, being non-judgmental, inquisitiveness, cosmopolitanism, and self-awareness, I think can assist in forming an attitude that a national or cultural border is no big deal. All right. If you then have borders on other forms of diversity, I think crossing that diversity border will also help in strengthening the personality traits that I've mentioned before. Now, these personality traits most recently have not been shown to be stable throughout life. There is a differential stability of these particular factors. However, they are almost easily influenced in young persons. So, using diversity in a learning situation where you set up a task for students working in collaborative learning groups, then the various dimensions of the task will affect which diversities are most relevant. And if you think of a task as a cognitive challenge, then of course you need to think about how the various diversities translate into a cognitive repertoire of an individual and consequently a cognitive repertoire of a group. So students that are being tasked with some challenge will actually need to discover which diversities are relevant and who in their group possesses the relevant characteristics. Let me take a very simple example, because we've asked students who've worked in multidisciplinary teams to tell us what they thought of being in a multidisciplinary team, and they tell us that it's actually wonderful not to have to learn the basics of this or that discipline, because they have students from their discipline who can tell them what is needed to surmount the particular challenge. So I think if you want to start utilizing diversity more generally, then I think in a final debriefing after a group has finished with the task, the educator should not just examine the final product. I mean, that's what we do mostly today, but should reflect with students on the process of achieving this product and the diversities that were relevant. Now, even children at the age of 6 can do this, but no educator will ever debrief them on the fact that they've used diversities to achieve a task. Let me make it very simple. Some kids in primary school are asked, let's play a competitive sports game, let's say, play soccer. And two pupils are pointed at and need to select a team. Now, the very first time they do this, and they don't know anything about their classmates, they'll pick their friends in the class, they'll pick the popular kids in class to be on their team. But after 3 or 4 games of the same sport, these children start to very specifically pick particular classmates because of their skills in aspects of the game of soccer. And in fact, they know how to do this with a very fine degree of accuracy. Well, no teacher ever stops and says, after a few games, let's think about why you pick certain people and then build on that with other diversities. Because the last chosen person, of course, not ever very nice to be the last chosen person in a team, might actually be fantastic at something with computers. So as a teacher, it's my task then to make sure that the talents or the diverse repertoires of my students at one time or another give the student a chance to shine in class and thereby enhance their self-confidence, and hopefully with some halo effects start to widen this confidence, this self-confidence over other aspects. So the point I'm making is about task relevance. In case of the international or cultural border crossing, think about it like this. If I give a group a challenge, let's say I say to a group of students, let's do international business students, let's write a business. I want you in groups to write a business plan for doing business with China. And this is an international group of students. If there are Chinese students, I'll guarantee you that most groups will want a Chinese student in there because it's very obvious. We need to do something about doing business with China. If we have a Chinese person in a group, chances are they understand the Chinese perspective on this and we might get a better product. If I set the same task in a molecular virology class, the relevance of international diversity will escape most people. And something else may be far more relevant. Now, it's this task relevance that dictates which of the diversities play an important role in as being part of an effective cognitive or psychomotor repertoire for the task. So, if we are to equip students, if we are to diffuse international borders, then I think throughout their education we should deliberately recognize and use the diversities required to overcome a challenge, especially early in life. And, importantly, make them aware how this contributed to achieving success. And I think this will arm them to cross a diversity of borders, whatever the source of diversity. So whether it's socio-economic, whether it's age, professional experience, you name it. The task at hand will determine which parts of their cognitive, affective, or psychomotor repertoire will need to be brought into action. I thank you all for listening to me.
That was Dr. Robert Colon. The next presentation would be by Dr. Fabrizio Shapiro. Any questions directed to Dr. Robert Colon or the next presentation, Dr. Fabrizio, will be sent to them. You may please drop in your questions or comments in the Q&A section. Yeah.
Dear colleagues, my name is Fabrizio Shapiro. I'm head of Quality Benchmark Services at Actis UK ENIC, what was formerly known as UK NARIC. I'd like to start by thanking the Manipal Academy for Higher Education for organizing this timely conference on cross-border education at a very challenging time. Well done for having successfully organized the event online. Unfortunately, I'm not able to contribute in the live session. I would have loved to do so and engaging in discussion because of a last-minute unavoidable commitment. But I'd like to thank the organizers for letting me still contribute to this recorded presentation. Now, one of the key dynamics of that we've witnessed within the international education landscape over the past few years or so in response to the global pandemic has been the growing importance of transnational education intended as the cross-border mobility of education programs rather than students. TNE as becoming an important way to reach to students who are unable or unwilling to cross borders internationally. And when reflecting on cross-border education, such as in this conference, it is important to also reflect on TNE and the impact that TNE may have on the future landscape. Now, what I like to do in the presentation is to focus on the challenging context for transnational education, a context characterized by quality assurance gaps and trust deficit, which impact on the recognition of TNE, on the portability of TNE qualifications, and therefore also what I believe is the incredible potential of transnational education for offering a more inclusive, more flexible, responsive, and possibly more sustainable route to international education. Now, against the backdrop of this contextual consideration, I will also outline an international service which we have developed at AESI, the TNE Quality Benchmark Scheme, which is aimed at providing an independent assurance to international stakeholders about the quality and standards of TNE operations, therefore facilitating the recognition of TNE. Now, a few words to start with about AESI. AESI has been a leading provider of international recognition services for over 20 years, since 1997, when the UK government signed the Lisbon Recognition Convention. We managed, on behalf of the UK government, the qualification recognition function, what was known as UK NARIC, now following Brexit, UK ENIC. We also manage other services on behalf of the UK government, and we offer also a number of global solutions of services to the international education community aimed at improving international understanding of and confidence in international qualifications. In this way, supporting the growth of quality international education. Now, turning to what I refer to as the global TNE quality assurance challenge, the international education community over the past 20 years has witnessed an incredible growth of transnational education in terms of education providers involved in it, types of education providers, in terms of students studying on TNE programs, countries sending or receiving transnational education, and also an increasing variety of models of TNE, particularly in the last few years, which contribute to making the current international education landscape very complex, but also increasingly competitive. The increasing strategic importance of TNE is reflected also in the fact that now growing TNE is an explicit target of many education providers, and it is an explicit target of many governments, either sending or receiving, either in sending or receiving countries. However, despite this growth, despite this growing strategic importance, which we may expect to continue post-COVID, since as I was saying, TNE, the international education community has been able to appreciate how TNE can help reaching to students who would be unable or who are unwilling to travel internationally to get a quality international education. So despite this growth and this potential, there are still important challenges, hurdles to the recognition of TNE as an acceptable mode of earning a qualification, challenges which relate to lack of trust and quality assurance. These are ultimately impacting on the recognition of TNE. Not all countries recognize TNE qualifications, in particular certain types of TNE qualifications, such as online learning, but also simply TNE qualifications obtained in third countries, in particular in third countries where there is no robust regulatory framework for higher education, for transnational education. Now, these challenges relate to a lack of trust, as I was saying, a lack of trust towards qualifications obtained through operations which are difficult to understand and difficult, and whose quality is difficult to appreciate and assess by part of international regulators and credential evaluators, in particular in the absence of an international framework for the quality assurance of transnational education and its recognition, and a lack of a shared understanding about what quality cross-border education should be. And without, just by way of example, very few countries, either sending or receiving countries, have established monitoring processes for transnational education. And those that do have monitoring process, quality assurance processes, do so in very different ways. In particular, usually existing national processes for the regulation, quality assurance, monitoring of TNE are national solutions, or solutions which address national needs, national priorities, often of a political nature, which means that these solutions, these approaches to quality assurance international education, where they exist, may not be fit for purpose to meet the assurance needs of the international education community of other countries, or cross countries, for example. And without such assurance, of course, it is difficult to provide that foundation upon which trust can be built and recognition granted to TNE qualifications, as the recently signed UNESCO Global Recognition Convention reminds us. And it is in response to this challenging context that activists, we have worked hard over the past year to develop a global solution to these quality assurance gaps and trust deficits by developing a scheme which can provide independent and international peer review of TNE operations with a view to facilitating international understanding of and confidence in TNE operations and qualifications which have been benchmarked, but also offering a platform for cooperation across borders and across the quality assurance and qualification recognition communities, as I will explain a bit more in a second. Now, the TNE quality benchmark scheme, we believe, is able to provide this reassurance, this international assurance, because it is based on 4 international pillars, or 4 international dimensions, which are strictly intertwined. First of all, it is international in scope. This means that it applies to all TNE, regardless of location of origin or delivery. It applies to Australian TNE, Malaysia, as well as Malaysian TNE in the UK, or UK TNE in India, or Indian TNE in the UAE, for example. It can be international in scope because it's underpinned by international standards which have been developed in consultation with our pool of international experts and in alignment with existing international reference points. and code of practices, such as the UNESCO AESI guidelines for cross-border education, the UNESCO Council of Europe Code of Good Practice, which underpin the regional recognition convention, but also the recently signed UNESCO Global Recognition Convention. And it is international in scope. It is underpinned by international standards, and it is implemented through international peer review. So the review teams looking at TINI operations are composed by experts from both and with an understanding of both the sending country higher education and quality assurance system and the host country's higher education and quality assurance system. This is to ensure that international standards are implemented with a sound understanding of the relevant location of operation for the TINI provision being reviewed. Also, and very importantly, there is an additional layer of international peer scrutiny, which is offered by the TINI Quality Benchmark Advisory Board, comprising leading international experts in the quality assurance, management, recognition of transnational education, and they review the outcomes of reviews, and making sure that they are based on sound evidence and that can inform the issue and the conferral of the TINI quality mark to benchmark operations and qualifications. And finally, but very, very importantly, international cooperation. The scheme is underpinned by international cooperation with sending and receiving countries' authorities, which is key to build a shared understanding and trust required to facilitate the recognition of TINI qualifications. So we have strategic memorandum of cooperations with bodies such as the Asian Pacific Quality Networks and the Arab Network of Quality Assurance in Higher Education, for example, or with the CSCSC in China, which is the Chinese Credential Evaluator, and who are able to use the outcome of our TINI reviews to better understand and evaluate qualification of Chinese students having studied on TINI qualifications outside of China. Very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, in terms of deliverables, a successful TINI operations, a successfully reviewed TINI operations will be able to use the TINI quality mark, signifying to international stakeholders that their provision can be trusted as being of good quality and standards. It will be listed for the same purpose on our TINI database, consulted widely by our network of credential evaluators, ministries, and providers. And importantly, graduates of successfully benchmarked provision will be able, if they need to ask for a certificate of comparability, stating and explaining that their qualifications have been obtained by studying through TINI operations, which has been robustly and independently reviewed against international standards of good practice. And finally, to conclude, we are making we're planning to make some changes moving forward to strengthen and expand the scope of the TINI review. At the moment, it applies at individual operational level, such as in a specific partnership between University X and institution Y. Now we are moving the TINI scheme to an institutional level, so that we can look and provide assurance about the whole portfolio of TINI operations that an institution may have. And also we are introducing the concept of a TINI community of good practice, where those institutions signing up to the TINI review will also be able to access strategic guidance and advice on a number of strategic area of work for TINI providers, such as international regulatory frameworks, recognition aspects, market insight, due diligence, partnership buildings, employabilities, and student satisfactions, and more. And this guidance and advice will be offered by ourselves, acted by our international TINI experts, but also by a selected number of specialized partner agencies. So we will be making an announcement about these two changes very soon. Now, I believe I've ran out of my 15 minutes. As I said, I would love and to answer any questions that the delegates may have. But I'm very keen to still do that. So if you have any questions, if you have any queries, please do get in touch by writing to this email address, tnqb@activist.com, where you can find more information on our TNQB website. With this, I conclude. I wish you good luck for the conclusion of the conference, and I thank again the Manipal Academy for Higher Education for organizing this conference. Thank you.
That was Dr. Fabrizio, and that brings us to the end of session 7. So we have already exceeded our session time, so let me quickly thank all the presenters for this session, and also Mr. Rahul Putty for chairing this session. Thank you.